Hello, everyone. I am Becky Spratford from RA for All, where I help library workers help readers find their next great read. And I'm happy to be your guest host for this segment of Every Library Live's Banned Book Week Fest today. Every Library is the National Political Action Committee for Libraries. The last few years have seen an alarming rise in the number of book bans in school and public libraries around the country. Every library has been directly involved in over 100 local campaigns to oppose censorship and defend the First Amendment, helping to restore books and preserve access. Its Fight for the First campaign platform, combined with its pro bono campaign advising, is making a difference. I'd like to invite you to check it out at fightforthefirst.org. All week, Every Library Live is focusing on not only the problem of book bans, but also on changing the headlines. We need to reconnect with reading and the joy it brings. We want to celebrate readers and writers and libraries because it is not just a fight against censorship, it's a fight to have a society where every story can be told and discovered. And that's why I'm so excited today to talk with authors Brian Rashad Fuller and Rebecca Brenner Graham about their books, their writing process, and their connection to readers and libraries. Thank you both for being here today. I'm going to start by asking we're going to have this conversation. There's just the three of us, there's only two of you. But I want you to introduce yourselves to the audience. Reading bios can be boring. I want to have a conversation and I want you to embrace that. So if you would please just talk about yourself, your books in general, and what you would love the people on here today to know about you. Oh, sorry. I'm going to let Rebecca go first. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name is Rebecca Brenner Graham, and I am author of Dear Miss Perkins, a story of Frances Perkins's efforts to aid refugees from Nazi Germany. It comes out from Kensington this January. I am a postdoctoral research associate at Brown University, but I just started that on August 1st. And the whole time I was writing the book, I was a full-time high school history teacher, which I think informed my approach. And also, I'm a huge reader, and I love books, not just saying that because it's Every Library.
Thank you, Rebecca. Brian, what about you? Let's talk about you and your book and all the stuff you want us to know about you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Brian Rashad Fuller, and I'm the author of Being Black in America Schools. So I am an educator. I work at a university in New York City called the New School. Prior to that, I was working in the K-12 system. So I taught third grade, taught elementary school, also worked in the district office in the New York City Public Schools, the largest school district in the country. And my book is essentially really dissecting or taking a look at the way that we educate Black and Brown or miseducate Black and Brown children within this country. And so I call my book a modern day twist of Dr. Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro, which was published 91 years ago in 1933. But yeah, I'm excited to be here and excited to get into the conversation.
Both of your books are so important and need to be read, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But before we do that, as I mentioned in the intro, and as we're doing all this week, some of you may have seen the other interviews I did as well. We really want to talk about reading and the not just the joy of reading, but how important it is to read. So before we talk about your books specifically and your journeys as writers, I want to first ask each of you to share your personal journey as readers. And, what kind of books were you drawn to originally? What was your access to books? How did you did not see yourself in the experiences and your experiences in the books you read? And did that change as you get older? And of course, if the library's involved, please bring it up. Brian, why don't you go first?
Yeah, awesome. I love that question. So my journey as a reader started very early. As a young child, I was obsessed with dinosaurs.
And so was my son.
And so because of that, that really started my journey as a reader. And when I say I had an obsession, I really did. So any book about dinosaurs, I was very interested in and wanting to read. And so really because of that, I was able to really advanced my reading skills a lot. So when I was in first grade, I was reading at a fifth grade level because I was so so obsessed with dinosaurs. But then as I got older, of course, that obsession kind of died down with dinosaurs, and I started becoming more interested in just reading in general, right? But one of the things and the challenges, I'm originally from South Carolina, and so I went to South Carolina public schools. I didn't really see myself in a lot of the books that I was reading, right? In my schools, even when I went to the libraries, and I loved libraries as a kid. My mom would always take me, and I would just be so excited to see all the books and just want to run through and pick a book. But oftentimes I didn't see a lot of representation of folks who look like me, writers who look like me. And at the time as a child, I really couldn't wrap my head around it or articulate it. But it was definitely prevalent. And then as I got older, that began to change because one, at home, I was being introduced to books and authors who looked like me, right? And so I think my family did a good job of trying to counter what was not happening in my schools. But it was, and then as I became more conscious, it became my own effort too to seek out those individuals such as James Baldwin and others who were representative of my lived experience and myself. And so it was, but yes, so I've always been an avid reader, always loved reading. It started with dinosaurs and my obsession with dinosaurs, and then it grew over time, and a lot of it was self-motivated too, as it related to seeking out books that were representative of my lived experience and those who look like me.
Can I take it one more step further with you? Because you then became an educator, especially you said you started with the third graders, which is such an important time in reading. Did you try to bring your lived experience? I'm assuming by then you understood what was missing from your own reading. How did you work to bring that into, obviously this is going to lead to your book, but how did you work to bring that into your classrooms for the kids that got to have you as a teacher?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so interestingly enough, and I talk a lot about this in the book, I taught at a charter school in New York City. And so a lot of the curriculum was already predetermined. And so we didn't have as much autonomy as teachers as I would have liked. And so because of that, I wasn't able to introduce a lot of the type of books that I would have wanted to. But one of the things that was really important for me was still to represent my students and show representation. And so anytime that I had the opportunity to recommend it, just like elective reading or other reading, I would always find children's books that represented them, right? And that showed their identities and just were empowering and uplifting. And I would also talk about individuals such that were inspiring to me as a kid, right? Like, so James Baldwin and others, Malcolm X and different people. And so I think it was something that was important to me and something that I brought in, but I had to, in a way, be creative and bringing it in, because it wasn't necessarily just the standard in my classroom based on my expectation as a teacher.
And I'm going to get to Rebecca in a second, but I think what's important for everyone to understand here is we reframe it with the fight we're in right now. There's places where you couldn't even do that, right? There are places, there are classrooms, there are states where you can't even mention those things. But even that, it's not in the curriculum. Right. And you had to go out of your way, and we're doing a disservice to people. And obviously your book is about this, but the reading is the important thing, right? The discovering it. Rebecca, I want you to answer the same question and share your journey as well.
Now I read both nonfiction and fiction, but as a kid, I read only nonfiction. And Brian, going back to the dinosaurs has empowered me to go back to a book called Monkeys and Apes that I took out repeatedly from my public school second grade library. And anyone who went to second grade with me. I don't know why they would be watching me now, but they would remember that I read that book repeatedly. After that, it was a biography. I was a huge biographies nerd as a kid, of Detective Alan Pinkerton, who I now understand to have been a union buster, so no longer a fan. But that was a biography that was available. I read all of, like literally probably all of the Childhood of Famous Americans, the Who Was series. I was a huge nonfiction nerd and a history kid. In terms of my perspectives being represented, I think that if I had read more fiction, they would have been. For example, the American Girl dolls were around. The Dear America series had young girls in them. But in the series of biographies that I gravitated to, it was a lot of presidents. It was a lot of, and none of them represented me. It was Detective Alan Pinkerton or whoever. And there were exceptions, but reflecting on that, I think that the fact that there was more female representation in fiction than nonfiction speaks to whether we take women seriously, which usually is not really.
Which is also sort of what your book's about, quite honestly, taking women seriously. We'll get to in a minute. But it is interesting because often there will be girl books and boy books. And even now, which is horrible, books are not gendered. They're all actually, they don't have a gender. They're made of paper. But, people talk about that. And it's terrible. I'm glad at least you were allowed to read the nonfiction, because there's still places where girls are sort of sent off to the fiction. And I'm glad that at least at your library that Monkeys and Apes book got to be well read by you. But yes, it's interesting because voracious readers tend to be like that. They tend to be obsessed with something and they keep going. But let's talk about now the meat of the conversation, really, because your books actively fight against the misrepresentation that's happening out there in the world. And really, you're taking a stand in ways that is very bold and maybe a little scary to some people, but you do it really well in your books. And you make an argument that I find impossible to argue against. That's just me. But both your nonfiction books directly challenge bigotry and or misogyny. They also could both be called social justice books by those who like that term and want to champion it, but also by those who think it's a bad thing. What both of you tackle with your direct and compelling prose is the fact that the white male Christian viewpoint is held up not only as the standard to everything, but oftentimes seen as the best, right? It's the way it has to be. And you both challenge that. But that insistence by our society causes great harm to everyone, no matter who they are. So I want to talk about this. I want to talk about your book specifically and how you did try to challenge this and really talk about these serious issues. And again, directly, but compellingly. These are books you want to read. This is not nonfiction that is going to bore you. You're going to be compelled by these stories and these books. And also reflect a little bit on the state of book banning in relation to this and what you think others can do to stand up to hate and fascism. You did your part by writing your books and appearing here, but what can you share with others? I know it's a lot and we can go back and forth. I want to talk about all these things. So maybe we'll start with your book and what you were trying to do to challenge what you saw in the world that needed some recontextualization. Rebecca, could you please go first?
My book is still right here next to me and also on the shelf behind me. It's a narrative nonfiction history. And just in two sentences, basically, Frances Perkins was the first woman cabinet secretary. She entered office in 1933. It was her idea to combine immigration and naturalization to create the Immigration Naturalization Service, the INS, which was in the Department of Labor. Previously, the Labor Department had been using a lot of its funding, not just its immigration funding, but a lot of its funding for deportations, and she totally reformed that. In that same year, there was an influx of refugees from Nazi Germany who were Jewish. And that was one of the first crises that the Labor Department faced, even though it was also during the Great Depression and those were related. So back to your question.
Yes.
While I was writing the book, on the side of my day job, I was teaching a class at American University called Social Forces. And that was what someone else named the class. But I found it to be, it was a survey, but I found it to be a helpful phrase. A social force is something like gender, race, class. It's also something like misogyny, racism, classism, anti-Semitism, colonialism, transphobia, the list goes on. And so I thought of those as social forces while writing my book. So within the narrative, Frances Perkins enters office, first woman cabinet secretary. And even her fans are like, well, what do we call you if it's not Mr. Secretary? There was a lot of unknown. One of my favorite pictures is like weirdly focused on under the table in the cabinet meeting, and you can see that she's wearing heels and has a little handbag next to her heels. No one else is wearing heels and no one else has a little handbag, so I didn't carry around whatever she had to carry around. In addition to gender being one of the moving pieces, most of the US was opposed to letting in a lot of new immigrants. And that would be proven repeatedly over the course of the different things that she tried to aid refugees, because she was very pro-immigrant, but there was not even a legal definition of refugees. So xenophobia and isolationism come up consistently throughout the narrative. Another thing that I do in the book is I treat anti-Semitism seriously as its own social force. And I think that my own Jewish background, and like I am Jewish, informed my understanding of that. The Nazis racialized it, but in the US, that has not been how anti-Semitism has worked historically. Like, so for example, I'm a white Jewish person. There might be Jewish people of color, but it's really its own separate social force. And I'll just mention one specific example because it also brings in colonialism and imperialism. I have a chapter that's about Alaska because Frances Perkins and some of her colleagues wanted to bring German Jewish refugees in through a separate immigration quota to settle the colonized territory of Alaska. So immediately we can see how colonialism and imperialism were central. But usually those forces won in American history, like almost always. There are countless examples. In this particular case, Americans did not want these Jewish white European refugees. They didn't want them so much that that overcame the drive to develop and settle Alaska.
And what I think is, listening to you talk, I hope people noticed it, but I'm going to pull a few things out. This is history, right? This is things that happened a few generations ago. A lot of it doesn't sound that different than now, right? The issues of immigration and xenophobia and all of these things, the issues of women in power, the issues of anti-Semitism, all of these different things that Rebecca has mentioned, people will use words like this to say her book is, trying to be woke or trying to be, keep down the general white perspective. But actually, she's recounting a history, and history repeats itself. And there's a reason it repeats itself, is because we don't learn from it. So I think that's really important. Thank you for going into those details. Same thing, Brian. Let's talk about your book and let's contextualize it, because your book tells you right from the title that we're going to do this, which I loved about it.
Yeah, I really first just want to thank Rebecca, because that a lot of what she described and talked about in her book really resonated. So my book, Being Black in American Schools, it grabs you right at the title, right? And it tells you what it's going to be about. And what my book does, so it's part memoir, part political nonfiction. And it really follows the life cycle of a student. And that student happens to be me, from pre-K all the way through college. And really uses that narrative piece, that memoir piece, to then shed light or illuminate some of the inherent injustices, racial, social, design injustices within our American way of educating children, right? And specifically Black and brown children. And I mentioned this in my first answer, but we were talking about history. And so I call my book a modern day twist of Dr. Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro, which was published 91 years ago in 1933. And in that book, he really he did he was the first of his kind to take a look at the way that we educate Black people in America, and he called it a miseducation. And a lot of what he talked about in his book is still very relevant today, and and a lot of that I talk about in my book. And essentially, I take you through the life cycle of a student. The student happens to be me, and I show how at every stage of the educational cycle, what I believe is happening is our American education system is perpetuating a racial and social caste system that is established within America, right? And that's upholding the white male perspective, and elevating that above all others, right? And so it's really interesting because it gets into a lot of the narrative. I talk about specific experiences in my classrooms, like for instance, in fourth grade during Black History Month, I wanted to learn about a particular Black prominent figure, Madam C.J. Walker. My teacher had asked us, what other figures should we learn about besides Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., because clearly there must be other important Black people as well, right? And so all of us students were raising our hands, and I raised my hand and I said, oh, we should learn about Madam C.J. Walker. And my teacher didn't know who that was, which, okay, it was a white teacher in South Carolina. But then when I went on to try to explain who Madam C.J. Walker was, said she was the first Black woman millionaire. She became famous through using a straightening comb on other Black women's hair. My teacher essentially scoffed at it, laughed, and said, nothing's important about another Black woman doing a Black woman's hair, right? And then just moved on. And so that right there was, not only did I not, was my, perspective shut down in a way that, me now as an educator, I can't even imagine doing something like that, right? But not only was my perspective shut down, but also my, experience, my culture wasn't expressed in the curriculum. When I tried to bring it up, it was made to be inferior or belittled. And so I use a lot of examples like that in the book, and then tie into how it's not a unique experience. My experience in my public schools in South Carolina mirror a lot of the experience of millions of our students across this country, right? And so yeah, and then also along with that, so the book is in 3 parts. So it's primary education, secondary education, and then post-secondary education, college and career. And then so in the career part, I really turn the lens back on myself, right? And look at myself as an educator and how even though I might have experienced some of the injustices and inherent racism that our education system is, in many ways, being an educator, sometimes I perpetuated them, right? Knowingly and unknowingly, I think, and it was important for me to do that and put that critical lens on myself too, because just because I'm a Black man and a Black male educator doesn't absolve me from perpetuating a white supremacist system and a white supremacist way of educating students. And so that was very important as well. And then I, give a lot of solutions in terms of how I think we can start to move forward from a legislative standpoint, from a government standpoint, but then also from, interpersonal relationships between teachers and students, ways that we can address things in curriculum. And so that's the overarching view of the book.
I think in your descriptions, you've both given really good reasons why people need to be aware of what you're writing about and how you are actively both working within these systems of oppression that are there for everyone, and acknowledging that they were there and that they're still there. I think it's really important. I want to say, because at heart, I'm a reader's advisor, which means I work at a library connecting books with readers. And I want to tell all of you watching this that Rebecca's book is perfect for all of you readers all your readers who've enjoyed all these history books, these narrative nonfiction stories of these important women who were lost to history. And there's tons of bestsellers like that. You should check out Rebecca's book. And I'm going to put Ryan on the spot a little bit, but your book reminded me a lot, I'm not putting pressure on you, of The Other Wes Moore. I don't know if you ever read that book. And, he is now governor of Maryland. So, or yeah, so, no pressure, but it's very similar to The Other West Moore, which is one of my favorite books I've ever gotten to read, and very similar, right? Using himself and using it. So the point I'm trying to make here, these are popular topics with our readers, but they are difficult topics. And so we want to make sure that we're listening to what they're telling you about their journey as readers and what they wrote in response. And I hope you listen to a few of the things they said and use that when you're talking to people who maybe are saying things like, well, like Brian's teacher, like, well, that's not important, right? But it is. Or like Rebecca's experience that the stories of women, for example, are fiction. They're not nonfiction. Well, she fixed that, right? And Brian is fixing that. So thank you for that. I know that was pretty weighty, and I really appreciate you sharing. You had to share a lot of your personal experience, which I hate that has to be done, but it is important to do that as well. So, but I want to end on a more positive and joyous note to get back to this whole idea that we're here to celebrate books and reading. So I want to give you each a chance, and Brian, you're going to go first, to lift others up. What authors are getting you excited today? Fiction, nonfiction, whatever it is. And what excites you? Tell us who people should be reading.
Yeah. So one author that definitely gets me excited today, a current author, is Dr. Bettina Love. And so, yeah, the excitement in your face shows. And so I love her work. Punished for Dreaming is an amazing book. So I would definitely recommend it for everyone. Even those who are interested in education and those who aren't, right? I think it's just a beautiful book. And so that's one. So again, I'll plug Dr. Bettina Love. Please research her and get her work. Also, to take it back old school, I'm always a big proponent of James Baldwin. I always am rereading James Baldwin, reading his essays, reading his novels, reading his talks. And so I think James Baldwin is always someone that I want to uplift because I think he's just such a phenomenal writer and one of the best writers of our time.
So ahead of his time. And I'm going to put a shout out for Dr. Bettina Love as well. I got to see her speak at a library conference. If you have a chance to see her speak anywhere, and I'm not a teacher, right? I'm a librarian, but it's the same spaces, but she's wonderful. Thank you for sharing those two. And Rebecca, what about you? What would you like to share?
I am 57 books into this year as an obsessive reader, but I also have friends that are a couple hundred books into this year. So just for context, I'm going to measure my answer to this question based on which author have I read the most books by this year. And that's a trans autistic author named Devin Price. They wrote Unmasking Autism, Unlearning Shame, and Laziness Does Not Exist. Laziness Does Not Exist has done the best job of honestly any book I've ever read at using broader structural forces, or what I historically would call social forces, to explain our world and our daily experiences it's not that Devin Price is trying to take any blame out of humans. It's not about that. It's just let's explain the world we live in and our daily lives through these structural social forces in their experience, whether it's transphobia or ableism or anything else. And then I also wanted to add that probably my core tenet as a reader is that all reading is good reading, with the exception of bigotry, right? But so I also wanted to throw in Caroline Kepnes, who's author of the You series. And that's, I guess I might call it a guilty pleasure. I just love all of her books. You, Hidden Bodies. It's a series. I think the third and the fourth in that series, I was the first reader and reviewer on NetGalley, the advanced copy website. And I just love her books. It's a social media psycho thriller, and they're just so fun.
So I'm going to do two things here. First of all, I just used Carolyn Kepnes' series in a talk I gave this morning to libraries to talk about the positive use of the second person in fiction. But also, I also told them to take the term guilty pleasures out of their vocabulary. You shouldn't have to be guilty to read something you'd like to read. And I know Brian approves of this as a teacher. You are a grown woman. You may read whatever you'd like. Also, children can read whatever they like. So I'm glad, though, that you like her and you talked about her because she's a great writer. And I believe she sets her books in Providence, and you are in Providence now, right? Teaching at Brown. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you so much for being here. Again, for sharing yourselves, for sharing your books, Please go check out both of their books from Kensington Press, right? I'm right with that, right? Yes, Kensington. Awesome. This is my third one, so I want to make sure I'm right. I'm so glad I got to talk to you. But as we wrap up this segment of Every Library Live, I want everyone watching to take a moment to think about how you can help safeguard libraries and the right to read. Every Library is a donor-supported organization that is at work every day fighting against censorship and discrimination. Please consider making a donation today to help them continue that critically important work. Please go to everylibrary.org/2024 to donate it now. I greatly appreciate it. I want to thank you again, Kensington authors of nonfiction, Brian Rashad Fuller and Rebecca Brenner Graham. Thank you for this discussion. And please come back tomorrow, later today, the rest of the week for more conversations just like this on Every Library Live. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you both.